Sometimes the people who knew you when you were nothing become the very ones who can't see who you've become. Sometimes the uniform they mock carries more weight than all their designer suits combined. Sometimes the quiet kid they overlooked grew up to save lives in ways they could never imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I am Master Sergeant David Chen, 43 years old, and I've spent the last 22 years in places most people can't pronounce, doing things I'm not allowed to talk about. But standing in the decorated gymnasium of Lincoln High School, watching my former classmates sip overpriced wine from plastic cups, I felt like I was 17 again, invisible, insignificant, and utterly out of place. The reunion committee had outdone themselves with the decorations. Golden streamers hung from the basketball hoops, and blown-up yearbook photos from 1999 covered the walls like ghosts from a life I'd tried to forget. The theme was then and now, and apparently, I was stuck permanently in the then category. I wore my dress blues because it was the only formal attire I owned. 22 years in the military doesn't leave much room for civilian fancy clothes. The fabric was crisp, the ribbons aligned with precision, the brass polished to mirror finish. It was a uniform that commanded respect in every corner of the world except, apparently, here. Oh my God, is that David Chen? The voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade. I turned to see Jessica Morrison approaching, her smile as predatory as it had been in high school. She'd traded her teenage cruelty for adult condescension, wrapped in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Look at you, still playing soldier," she said, loud enough for the nearby conversation circles to hear. "Some people really never leave high school, do they?" Her laugh was crystalline and sharp, designed to cut. A few former classmates turned our way, drawn by the familiar scent of social blood in the water. Marcus Webb, who'd been the star quarterback before his knee injury ended his college dreams, joined Jessica with the confidence of someone who'd never learned that high school glory had an expiration date. He wore a tailored suit that screamed middle management success, and carried himself like he still owned every room he entered. "Chen, damn man, you look exactly the same," Marcus said, clapping me on the shoulder with the casual assumption of friendship we'd never shared. "Still in costume, I see. What is it now, Army? Navy?" He gestured vaguely at my uniform, the dismissive wave of someone who'd never bothered to learn the difference. "Air Force," I replied quietly, my voice steady, despite the familiar knot forming in my stomach. Right. Flying around in helicopters and stuff." Marcus grinned, turning to address the growing audience. "Remember when Chen tried to join ROTC junior year? What happened with that anyway? Didn't make the cut?" The lie hit its mark perfectly. I'd never tried to join ROTC in high school. I'd been too busy working 2 part-time jobs to help my immigrant parents keep food on the table. But Marcus had always been skilled at rewriting history to suit his narrative. "I heard he's been overseas," Jessica added, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Fighting the good fight, right, David? How noble." The word noble in her mouth sounded like an insult. I stood there, surrounded by people who'd known me when I was nothing, watching them perform the same cruel theater that had driven me from this place decades ago. They saw the uniform and saw a costume, a desperate man clinging to relevance. They couldn't see the Afghanistan mountains where I'd crawled through Taliban fire to extract wounded Marines. They couldn't see the Syrian border, where I'd coordinated airstrikes that saved an entire refugee convoy. They couldn't see the classified operations in places that didn't officially exist, where my decisions meant the difference between international incidents and peaceful resolutions. "So what do you actually do, David?" This came from Sarah Kim, who'd been class president and was now apparently some kind of tech executive based on her confident networking stance. I mean, day to day. "Are you like a recruiter or something?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions. In their minds, I was the kid who'd sat alone at lunch, who'd never gone to prom, who'd disappeared after graduation without a trace. The military was my consolation prize, my backup plan for a life that had never quite worked out. "I work in special operations," I said simply, knowing the words would mean nothing to them. "Oh, special operations. Marcus repeated with air quotes, grinning at his audience. Sounds very mysterious and important. More laughter rippled through the group. The gymnasium suddenly felt suffocating. The smell of industrial disinfectant, mixed with cheap perfume, and the lingering odor of decades of teenage sweat embedded in the walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in the same harsh, unflattering glow I remembered from my adolescence. I excused myself and walked toward the display tables the reunion committee had set up near the entrance. They'd organized photos and memorabilia from our high school years, a nostalgic shrine to what they apparently considered the best years of our lives. There were team photos, prom pictures, and a yearbook signing station where people were reconnecting over shared memories I'd never been part of. That's when I saw it. A memorial section for classmates who'd died since graduation. 3 names, 3 faces, 3 stories cut short. And there, in the corner of the memorial display, was something that made my blood run cold. A small, faded newspaper clipping from our senior year that I'd hoped no one would remember. The headline read, "Local Teens Science Project Destroyed in School Fire." Below it was a grainy photo of 17-year-old me, standing in front of the charred remains of what had been my life's work. David? The voice behind me was softer, uncertain. I turned to see Emma Rodriguez, who'd been one of the few people in high school who'd ever spoken to me with genuine kindness. She looked successful, confident, but her eyes held the same warmth I remembered. "I thought that was you," she said. "You look..." She paused, taking in the uniform, the ribbons, the obvious weight of years and experience. "You look good. Really good." "Thank you," I managed. "I remember this," she said, nodding toward the newspaper clipping. "The fire in the science building. You were building some kind of satellite, weren't you? For the state competition?" Her voice held genuine curiosity, not the mocking tone I'd grown accustomed to tonight. The memory hit me like a physical blow, the smell of smoke and burned electronics. The months of work reduced to ash. The competition I'd never got to attend. But more than that, the reason the fire had started in the first place. "It was a communications satellite," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "A working prototype that could have revolutionized emergency response communications in remote areas." Emma's expression shifted to something approaching awe. "And it was destroyed?" I nodded, unable to say more. How could I tell her that it wasn't just destroyed, it was sabotaged? How could I explain that Marcus Webb and his friends had broken into the science building that night as a prank, never meaning to start a fire, but destroying everything I'd worked for nonetheless? How could I describe watching my future burn while they got away with a slap on the wrist because their parents had connections and I was just the weird Asian kid whose opinion didn't matter? "David, I had no idea," Emma said softly. "I remember how devastating that was for you. And then you just disappeared after graduation." "I enlisted," I said. 3 days after we graduated. I figured if I couldn't build satellites, maybe I could learn to use them. The conversation was interrupted by feedback from the microphone at the front of the gymnasium. Principal Martinez, the same man who'd been principal during our senior year, was calling for attention. He looked older, grayer, but his voice still carried the authority that had once commanded respect from 1,000 teenagers. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention," he called out. "Before we continue with tonight's festivities, I have a special presentation to make." The crowd began to gather, wine glasses in hand, expecting some light-hearted trip down memory lane. I started to move toward the exit, but Emma caught my arm. "Stay," she said firmly, "please." I looked back at the group that had been mocking me minutes before. Marcus and Jessica stood near the front, still wearing their smug expressions. They were probably expecting some kind of participation trophy presentation, another chance to relive their glory days. Principal Martinez cleared his throat and continued. 25 years ago, we lost something precious in the fire that destroyed our science building. Not just equipment or projects, but dreams. Specifically, the dreams of one young man whose brilliance was already evident to those of us who were paying attention. A murmur went through the crowd. I felt my heart begin to race. What we didn't lose, the the principal continued, was that young man's determination. David Chen graduated from our school and went on to serve his country with a distinction that none of us could have imagined. And tonight, I have the honor of correcting a long overdue oversight. The gymnasium fell completely silent. I could feel every eye in the room turning toward me, but I couldn't move. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Ladies and gentlemen, Principal Martinez said, his voice growing stronger, please join me in recognizing our very own. The words that came next would change everything. The silence stretched like a held breath. Principal Martinez reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an official-looking document, the kind of government paperwork that carries weight beyond its simple appearance. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing our very own Medal of Honor recipient, Master Sergeant David Chen. The words detonated in the gymnasium like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by a silence so profound I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Every face in the room turned toward me, with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something approaching awe. Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Fewer than 3,500 people in American history had ever received it. And somehow, impossibly, I was one of them. Marcus Webb's face had gone completely white. The confident smirk he'd worn all evening vanished, replaced by something between confusion and horror. Jessica Morrison's mouth hung open, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly looking garish under the harsh gymnasium lights. The plastic wine cup in her hand trembled slightly. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered, but his voice carried in the absolute silence of the room. Principal Martinez's voice cut through their shock. 3 months ago, I received a call from the Pentagon. They were trying to locate David Chen, class of 1999, to inform him that his actions during Operation Desert Shield in Afghanistan had been declassified and reviewed for the highest honors. It took them 6 months to track down every witness, every piece of evidence, every detail of what happened on March 15, 2018. My chest tightened. March 15, 2018. The day I'd tried for 5 years to forget. The day that had earned me a chest full of ribbons and a lifetime of nightmares. The official citation, Principal Martinez continued, unfolding the document, reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as Special Operations Air Force Combat Controller with the 24th Special Tactics Squadron during combat operations against an armed enemy in the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan." The words felt surreal, floating in the air above a crowd of people who 30 minutes ago had been mocking my uniform. Emma Rodriguez stood beside me, her hand still on my arm, her eyes wide with something approaching reverence. On the morning of March 15, 2018, the principal read, Master Sergeant Chen's unit was providing close air support for a humanitarian convoy when they came under intense enemy fire from fortified positions. When the convoy became trapped in a canyon with no escape route, Master Sergeant Chen voluntarily exposed himself to heavy machine gun and mortar fire to establish communications with friendly aircraft. The memory crashed over me like a wave, the taste of dust and blood in my mouth, the screaming of wounded children from the convoy, the impossible choice between staying in cover and saving lives. Despite being wounded by shrapnel, Master Sergeant Chen continued to direct precision airstrikes while simultaneously treating wounded civilians. When his radio equipment was destroyed by enemy fire, he used emergency flares and mirror signals to continue coordinating the rescue operation. I could see it all again. The refugee convoy, mostly women and children fleeing Taliban persecution. The ambush that had turned a routine escort mission into a nightmare. The moment when I realized that if I didn't act, everyone in that canyon would die. For over 3 hours, Master Sergeant Chen remained in the open, drawing enemy fire away from the civilians while coordinating the evacuation. His actions directly resulted in the successful rescue of 127 refugees, including 43 children. The gymnasium was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Faces that had looked at me with derision now stared with something I'd never seen in this place: respect. But Principal Martinez wasn't finished. The citation concludes, Master Sergeant Chen's extraordinary heroism, selfless service, and unwavering devotion to duty reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Air Force. His actions embody the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States of America. The applause started slowly, uncertainly, then built into something thunderous. But I barely heard it. I was still in that canyon, still tasting the dust, still hearing the cries of the wounded. Emma's grip on my arm tightened. "David," she whispered, "why didn't you tell anyone?" How could I explain that the medal felt like a weight rather than an honor? That every time I looked at those ribbons on my chest, I thought about the 6 men from my unit who didn't make it home? That the children I'd saved had faces that haunted my dreams? "I don't talk about it," I managed to say. The crowd was pressing closer now, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of something they couldn't dismiss or diminish. But their sudden reverence felt almost as uncomfortable as their contempt had been. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd, his face flushed red with what I realized was shame. "David, I had no idea. What I said earlier, the way I—" "It's fine," I said, but my voice came out flat, emotionless. "No, it's not fine," Marcus insisted. "Jesus, we were assholes. All of us." He looked around at the faces surrounding us, many of which reflected his own mortification. Jessica Morrison approached more hesitantly, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "David, I'm so sorry. If we had known—" "Known what?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "That you should only treat people with respect if they have a medal? That human decency requires a background check?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Because that was exactly what they meant, wasn't it? For 25 years, I'd been the weird kid, the failure, the one who'd never amounted to anything. Now, suddenly I was worthy of their attention because a piece of government paperwork said so. "That's not what I meant," Jessica protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" I looked around at the circle of faces, seeing the same people who had made my teenage years miserable now scrambling to align themselves with my unexpected success. An hour ago, I was playing soldier in a costume. What's changed? The truth was settling over them like a cold fog. They were realizing that they'd spent the evening mocking a war hero, someone who'd risked his life to save children, while they'd been climbing corporate ladders and accumulating meaningless status symbols. But there was something else in their expressions, something that cut deeper than embarrassment. It was the dawning recognition that they'd fundamentally misjudged, not just my achievements, but my character. The quiet kid they'd dismissed had possessed something they'd never had, the courage to put others before himself. "You want to know what really happened that night in March?" I asked, my voice carrying across the silent gymnasium. "You want to know what it's really like to earn something like this?" They nodded eagerly, hungry for details that would help them process their guilt. "It started at 0600 hours with intelligence reports of Taliban movement in the Kunar province," I began, my voice taking on the clinical tone I used for debriefings. "Our unit was tasked with providing air support for a refugee convoy, mostly women and children from villages the Taliban had marked for, quote, cleansing." I could see them hanging on every word, trying to reconcile the man speaking with the teenager they remembered. The convoy was supposed to be a routine escort mission. 3 hours from pickup to the safety of the forward operating base. But intelligence was wrong. The Taliban had been tracking the convoy for days, setting up an ambush in Tangi Canyon. The room was absolutely still. Even the reunion music had stopped playing. When the mortars started falling, we had maybe 30 seconds before the canyon became a killing field. The convoy was trapped. Steep walls on both sides. Enemies in fortified positions above us. No way out except through them. I paused, remembering the weight of the decision. Protocol was to call for immediate extraction and let the air assets handle it from a distance. Safe, clean, by the book. But that would have taken 20 minutes, and those people didn't have 20 minutes. Marcus Webb swallowed hard. "What did you do?" "I broke every rule I'd ever been taught," I said simply. "I left cover, established an observation position in the open, and started painting targets for the A-10s while providing medical aid to the wounded. For 3 hours, I drew fire away from civilians, while coordinating close air support missions, danger close to friendly positions. The technical details meant nothing to them, but they could hear the weight of it in my voice. The radio equipment was destroyed in the first hour. After that, it was signal mirrors, flares, and hand signals to communicate with aircraft flying at 300 miles per hour. By the time the evacuation was complete, I'd taken shrapnel in my leg and shoulder. But all 127 refugees made it out alive. Silence stretched across the gymnasium. These people who'd built their identities around high school achievements and corporate success were confronting something beyond their comprehension: genuine heroism. 6 men from my unit died in other operations that year, I continued, my voice growing quieter. Better men than me, braver men, men with families waiting for them. The medal isn't about being special. It's about being in the right place when people needed someone to make an impossible choice. The weight of that truth settled over the room. This wasn't a story about triumph or glory. It was about sacrifice, about the terrible arithmetic of war where someone has to decide which lives matter most. Emma Rodriguez finally broke the silence. David, you saved 127 people, 43 children. I did my job, I replied. Nothing more, nothing less. But even as I said it, I could see in their faces that they understood something I'd spent 5 years trying to accept. Sometimes doing your job requires becoming someone you never imagined you could be. The reunion was transforming around us, the shallow celebration of past glories, giving way to something deeper and more uncomfortable. A reckoning with the casual cruelty of adolescence and the profound distance between who we thought we were and who we actually became. Principal Martinez stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. There's something else, David. Something I think this room needs to understand about the young man we failed to see clearly all those years ago. My stomach clenched. There was more? Principal Martinez walked to the memorial display and picked up the faded newspaper clipping about the science building fire. His weathered hands held it carefully, like evidence that had finally found its courtroom. 25 years ago, we told this community that the fire in our science building was an electrical malfunction, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward. We said that David's satellite project was simply an unfortunate casualty of faulty wiring and old infrastructure. My blood turned to ice water. The familiar taste of bile rose in my throat as I realized where this was heading. That was a lie, Principal Martinez continued, his eyes finding mine across the silent gymnasium. A lie I've carried for 25 years, and one I should have corrected long ago. Marcus Webb had gone completely pale. His expensive suit suddenly looked like it was strangling him, and I could see a thin sheen of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Jessica Morrison took an unconscious step backward, as if distance might somehow protect her from what was coming. The fire was not an accident, the principal said, his voice cutting through the gymnasium like a blade. It was started by 4 students who broke into the building that night as what they called a senior prank. They were drinking, celebrating early graduation, and they thought it would be funny to mess with some of the science projects. The silence in the room had become something alive, something that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. Every person in that gymnasium knew exactly which 4 students he was talking about. The same 4 who had ruled the school through intimidation and popularity, who had made my life hell for 4 years, who had walked across the graduation stage 3 days later like nothing had happened. They knocked over David's satellite array, damaged months of delicate work, and when they tried to cover their tracks by rearranging things, they caused an electrical short that started the fire, Principal Martinez continued. By the time the fire department arrived, not only was David's project destroyed, but the entire science wing was gutted. I felt Emma's hand tighten on my arm, but I couldn't look at her. I was 17 again, standing in the smoldering ruins of my dreams, watching the fire chief explain to my parents in broken English that their son's project had been accidentally destroyed. Watching my mother's face crumble as she realized that the college scholarships I'd been counting on, the ones tied to that state science competition, had just gone up in smoke. The 4 students came to me the next morning, Principal Martinez said, and his voice carried the weight of decades of regret. They were terrified, facing potential criminal charges for breaking and entering, vandalism, and arson. Their parents, prominent members of this community, convinced me that pressing charges would ruin 4 promising young lives over what was essentially a prank gone wrong. Marcus Webb made a sound like a wounded animal. Several people in the crowd turned to stare at him, and I could see the recognition dawning on their faces. They remembered who had been tight with the principal's office that spring, who had gotten away with everything, who had seemed untouchable. I made a choice, the principal continued, and his voice cracked slightly. I chose to protect 4 students who came from families with lawyers and connections and influence, and in doing so, I failed the one student who needed protection most. I failed David Chen. The words hung in the air like an indictment, not just of those 4 students, but of the entire system that had valued their futures over mine. The administration that had chosen to preserve the reputations of the popular kids, rather than seek justice for the weird Asian kid whose opinion didn't matter. David never knew, Principal Martinez said, looking directly at me. We told him it was an electrical fire because we thought it would be kinder than the truth. We thought he was better off not knowing that his dreams had been deliberately destroyed by his classmates. But I had known. Maybe not the details, maybe not the specifics, but some part of me had always known. The way they'd looked at me in those final weeks of school. The way Marcus had smirked when he passed me in the hallways. The way they'd all acted like nothing had happened while I walked around campus like a ghost, mourning the future that had been stolen from me. Those 4 students graduated with honors, the principal said, and the bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. They went on to prestigious colleges, successful careers, and comfortable lives. Meanwhile, David enlisted in the military because his backup plans had become his only plans. I could hear someone crying softly in the crowd, but I couldn't tell who it was. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright suddenly, and I felt like I was drowning in the stale air of the gymnasium. I want everyone in this room to understand something, Principal Martinez said, his voice growing stronger. David Chen didn't just overcome the loss of his project. He didn't just bounce back from disappointment. He rebuilt his entire life from the ashes of someone else's cruelty. And he did it with more grace and dignity than any of us deserved. Marcus Webb suddenly pushed through the crowd, his face red and streaked with tears I'd never seen him shed. David, God, I'm so sorry. We never meant, we were just drunk kids and we never thought. You never thought what? I asked, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Calm, almost conversational. You never thought it mattered? You never thought I mattered? We were 18, Marcus pleaded. We were stupid. We didn't understand what we were destroying. You understood enough to cover it up, I replied. You understood enough to let me believe it was my fault somehow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You understood enough to let me walk across that graduation stage thinking I'd failed. Jessica Morrison stepped forward, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams. David, please, we were kids. We made a terrible mistake, but we've grown up. We're different people now. Are you? I asked. Because 30 minutes ago, you were mocking my uniform and calling me a failure. What's changed? The fact that you got caught? The fact that everyone knows what you did? The truth of it settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They weren't sorry for what they'd done 25 years ago. They were sorry that the consequences had finally caught up with them. Sorry that their perfect reunion narrative had been shattered by the inconvenient presence of their victim. I want to tell you all something about the young man you destroyed that night, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the silent gymnasium. That satellite project wasn't just a science fair entry. It was my ticket out of poverty. My parents had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hopes for their children's education. They worked double shifts at restaurants and laundromats so I could buy the components for that project. I could see my words hitting their target, could see the weight of understanding settling on their faces. That satellite was going to win the state competition. I was going to get a full scholarship to MIT. I was going to study aerospace engineering. And maybe, someday, work for NASA. That was the dream you burned down because you thought it would be funny to mess with the weird kid's project. Emma's grip on my arm had become painful, but I barely noticed. Instead, I enlisted 3 days after graduation because it was the only way I could afford college eventually. The GI Bill became my MIT scholarship. The Air Force became my laboratory. And every single day for 22 years, I've carried the weight of wondering who I might have become if you hadn't stolen that future from me. The gymnasium was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system cycling. These people who had spent the evening celebrating their accomplishments were confronting the brutal reality that their success had been built, in part, on the destruction of someone else's dreams. But here's what you never understood, I continued, and for the first time that night, I felt something like peace settling over me. You couldn't destroy who I was meant to become. You could burn down my project, you could steal my scholarship, you could force me to take a different path. But you couldn't stop me from becoming the person I was always meant to be. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who had tormented me, dismissed me, forgotten me. I became a warrior. I became someone who stands between the innocent and those who would harm them. I became someone who makes the hard choices, who sacrifices for others, who does what's right even when no one is watching. And every single person I've saved, every life I've protected, every mission I've completed, that's a victory you can't take away from me. The applause started slowly, tentatively, then built into something thunderous. But this time it felt different. It wasn't the shocked recognition of unexpected celebrity. It was something deeper. Acknowledgement, respect, maybe even a kind of awe. Principal Martinez raised his hand for silence. "There's one more thing," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing another document. "David, in 1999, our school established an annual award for the graduating senior who best exemplifies academic excellence, moral character, and service to others. The Chen Award." My knees nearly buckled. "What?" "We named it after you," he said simply, "after what we should have seen in you all along. For 25 years, we've given this award to students who remind us of the young man we failed to protect, the young man who went on to embody everything education should strive to create." He handed me the document, a formal certificate designating me as the first recipient of the Chen Award, backdated to 1999. "You were always the winner, David," he said quietly. "We were just too blind to see it." I stood there in the gymnasium where I'd once been invisible, holding a piece of paper that said I'd always mattered, surrounded by people who finally understood the weight of their choices. The scared 17-year-old who had watched his dreams burn was still there inside me, but he wasn't alone anymore. He was part of something larger, a story of resilience, of transformation, of becoming more than anyone thought possible. The reunion continued around us, but it had become something different. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. People approached me not with the false intimacy of shared adolescence, but with the respectful distance due to someone whose life had taken paths they couldn't imagine. As the evening wound down, I found myself back at the memorial display, looking at that newspaper clipping one more time. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't the record of my failure. It was the beginning of my real story. The moment when I learned that the world could be cruel and unfair, but that I had the strength to rise above it. Emma approached me as I prepared to leave. "David," she said softly, "I want you to know that some of us saw who you really were, even then. Some of us knew you were going to do something extraordinary with your life." I smiled at her, the first genuine smile I'd worn all evening. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." As I walked out of Lincoln High School for what would probably be the last time, I carried with me not the bitterness of old wounds, but the satisfaction of a life well lived. The scared kid who had left this place 25 years ago had become exactly who he was meant to be. And no one could ever take that away from me. The drive home from the reunion took me through the old neighborhoods of my childhood, streets I hadn't traveled in decades. Everything looked smaller somehow, diminished by time and perspective. The ranch houses that had once seemed like mansions now appeared modest, their perfect lawns and manicured hedges unable to hide the ordinariness beneath. I pulled into the parking lot of Wang's Garden, the Chinese restaurant where my parents had worked when I was growing up. It was past midnight, but the neon sign still flickered in the window, casting red and green shadows across the empty asphalt. This was where it had all started, where my mother had served sweet and sour pork to the parents of my classmates, while saving every tip to buy components for my science projects. The building looked different now, renovated and modernized, but I could still remember being 12 years old and doing homework at table 6 in the back corner while my parents worked late shifts. I could still smell the mixture of soy sauce and industrial cleaning solution, could still hear the clatter of dishes and the endless loop of Mandarin pop music from the kitchen radio. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma Rodriguez. "Thank you for tonight. You gave us all something to think about. I hope you find peace with everything." I smiled and typed back a simple thank you before putting the phone away. More messages followed over the next few days. Some were apologies, stilted and awkward, from former classmates who had suddenly realized they'd spent decades carrying the wrong story. Others were congratulations, as if my Medal of Honor was somehow a personal victory they could share in. A few were genuine attempts at connection, people who wanted to understand how the quiet kid they'd ignored had become someone worth knowing. But the message that mattered most came from an unexpected source. It was from Tyler Brooks, one of Marcus Webb's old crew, someone who had participated in that night 25 years ago but hadn't been at the reunion. "David," the message read, "I heard what happened at the reunion. I wasn't there because I couldn't face you. I've been carrying the guilt of that night for 25 years. I know it's too little, too late, but I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't regret what we did. We were cowards then, and I've been a coward every day since by not reaching out to apologize. Your satellite project was brilliant. You deserved so much better from all of us." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something unexpected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release. These people had carried their guilt for 25 years while I had carried my anger. Neither burden had served any useful purpose. The past couldn't be changed, but maybe it could finally be laid to rest. 2 weeks later, I received a formal invitation that changed everything. It was from the Pentagon, requesting my presence at a ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. But this wasn't about me. It was about establishing a new scholarship program for underprivileged students pursuing STEM education. They wanted me to be the keynote speaker. The ceremony was held at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Standing before an audience of military officials, educators, and scholarship recipients, I found myself thinking about that 17-year-old kid who had watched his dreams burn in a high school fire. 25 years ago, I began, my voice echoing in the vast hall beneath the suspended aircraft. I lost everything I thought I needed to succeed. My project was destroyed, my scholarship opportunities vanished, and my carefully planned future disappeared overnight. At the time, it felt like the end of the world. I paused, looking out at the faces in the audience, young students who reminded me of myself at that age, full of hope and ambition and vulnerability. What I didn't understand then was that losing my original plan forced me to discover who I really was. The satellite I built in high school was impressive, but it was nothing compared to the communication systems I would later design for combat operations. The scholarship I lost led me to the GI Bill, which gave me something more valuable than a free education. It gave me the discipline and perspective that only comes from serving something larger than yourself. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me. She was maybe 19, with the kind of intense focus I recognized from my own teenage years. Her name was Sarah Patel, and she was one of the scholarship recipients. "Sir," she said, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the scholarship program, but for the story you told. I'm a sophomore at Caltech, and I'm the first person in my family to go to college. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong there, like I'm not smart enough or connected enough to succeed." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I saw myself in her uncertainty, in the way she held herself like she was ready to disappear if someone told her she didn't belong. "Can I tell you something?" I said. "Intelligence isn't about having all the right answers. It's about asking the right questions and being willing to work harder than everyone else to find the solutions. You belong wherever your mind can take you." She smiled, and for a moment, I saw the confident scientist she was going to become. Over the following months, I found myself doing something I'd never expected: becoming a mentor. Students from the scholarship program reached out with questions about everything from advanced physics to dealing with imposter syndrome. I discovered that my years in the military had given me something valuable to share. The knowledge that strength comes not from avoiding failure, but from learning how to rebuild after everything falls apart. One afternoon, while I was working in my office at Vandenberg Air Force Base, my assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. She says she's from your high school." I looked up, expecting to see Emma, or perhaps another former classmate. Instead, I found myself face to face with Mrs. Patterson, my old physics teacher. She was in her 70s now, her hair completely white, but her eyes still held the same sharp intelligence I remembered. "David," she said, her voice warm with emotion, "I hope you don't mind me visiting unannounced. I had to see you." "Mrs. Patterson," I said, standing up and offering her a chair. "Of course. It's wonderful to see you." She sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "I want you to know that I never believed the story about the electrical fire," she said without preamble. "I knew those boys had been in the building that night. I knew what they'd done to your project." My chest tightened. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was a coward," she said simply. "I was afraid of their parents, afraid of the administration, afraid of losing my job. I told myself that you were strong enough to overcome it, that maybe it was better for you not to know the truth." Tears began to slide down her cheeks. "I've regretted that decision every day since." I reached across the desk and took her weathered hands in mine. "Mrs. Patterson, you were the one teacher who saw something in me. You encouraged my curiosity, you challenged me to think bigger. That mattered more than you'll ever know. But I failed you when you needed me most," she whispered. "No," I said firmly. "You planted seeds that took decades to grow. Every mission I've flown, every life I've saved, every problem I've solved, it all started in your classroom with the questions you taught me to ask." We talked for an hour about physics and possibilities, about the students she'd taught and the lives they'd built. When she finally stood to leave, she handed me a small, wrapped package. "This was yours," she said. "I saved it from the fire." Inside the package was a small circuit board, blackened and damaged, but still recognizable. It was part of the communication array from my satellite project, the piece that had taken me months to design and build. "I thought someday you might want to remember where it all began," she said. After she left, I sat in my office holding that burnt circuit board, thinking about the strange mathematics of a life. How many small decisions and random encounters had led me to this moment? What if the fire had never happened? What if I'd won that scholarship and gone to MIT as planned? Would I have become the person I was meant to be? Or would I have become someone smaller, someone who had never been tested by real adversity? There was no way to know, and I realized that was the point. We don't get to choose our challenges, but we do get to choose how we respond to them. The 17-year-old who had watched his dreams burn had made a choice to rebuild rather than surrender. Every day since then had been a continuation of that same choice. 6 months later, I received news that changed everything once again. The Air Force was establishing a new research facility focused on advanced satellite communication systems, and they wanted me to head the program. It was everything I'd dreamed of as a teenager. Cutting-edge technology, unlimited resources, the chance to push the boundaries of human knowledge. But more than that, it was a chance to build something that would outlast my own service. Something that would continue saving lives long after I was gone. On my last day at Vandenberg, I cleaned out my office and found myself holding that burnt circuit board one more time. Instead of packing it away, I placed it on the desk in a simple frame with a small plaque that read, "From the ashes of our failures, we build our futures." The young officer taking over my position asked about it, and I told him the story. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. About bullies and fires and dreams that seemed destroyed, but were actually just being transformed into something better. "Sir," he said when I finished, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if none of it had occurred? If your project hadn't been destroyed?" I smiled, thinking of the scholarship students I'd mentored, the lives saved by the communication systems I'd designed. The young woman named Sarah Patel, who is now working on her doctoral thesis in quantum physics. "No," I said. "I don't wonder about that anymore, because I know something now that I didn't know at 17. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you'll ever do. As I drove away from the base for the last time, I realized that the scared kid from Lincoln High School was finally, completely at peace. Not because his tormentors had been exposed, or because his achievements had been recognized, but because he had learned the most important lesson of all: that our worth isn't determined by what others think of us, but by what we choose to do with the strength we discover in our darkest moments. The reunion had ended, but the real story, the story of becoming who we're meant to be, was just beginning. The new research facility was unlike anywhere I'd ever worked. Nestled in the Colorado mountains, the building seemed to grow from the landscape itself, all glass and steel and impossible angles that caught the morning light like a prism. Inside, the laboratories hummed with the quiet energy of discovery. Young scientists and engineers bent over workbenches where the future was being assembled one component at a time. My office overlooked a valley where elk grazed in the early morning mist, a view so different from the windowless command centers where I'd spent most of my career that I sometimes felt like I was dreaming. But the work was real enough. Designing communication systems that would connect astronauts to Earth from Mars, satellites that could maintain contact through solar storms, technology that would make the impossible routine. The team I assembled came from everywhere: MIT graduates who'd never left academia, former NASA engineers looking for new challenges, young prodigies who thought in programming languages I was still learning. What they all had in common was the same hunger I'd felt at 17, the desperate need to push beyond what everyone else thought was possible. Among them was Dr. Rachel Kim, a brilliant quantum engineer who reminded me of myself at that age. She worked 18-hour days, survived on vending machine coffee, and had the kind of focused intensity that made her forget to eat meals. She'd grown up poor in Seattle, the daughter of immigrants who ran a small grocery store, and she carried herself with the careful confidence of someone who'd learned never to take success for granted. "Dr. Chen," she said one evening, as we worked late on a particularly complex relay system, "can I ask you something personal?" I looked up from the schematics spread across my desk. "Of course." "How do you deal with the voice?" she asked, her hands still moving across her tablet as she spoke. "The one that tells you that you don't belong here? That you're not smart enough? That eventually someone's going to figure out you're a fraud?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I set down my pen and really looked at her. This brilliant young woman who was revolutionizing satellite communication technology, who held 3 advanced degrees and had patents pending in 2 countries, and who was asking me about the same fear that had haunted me for decades. "You want to know the truth?" I said. "It never goes away. Not completely. But you learn to make it smaller." She stopped typing and looked at me directly. "How?" "By remembering that everyone in this room, everyone who's ever done anything worth doing, has felt exactly the same way," I said. "The difference between people who succeed and people who don't isn't the absence of doubt. It's the willingness to work anyway." We talked until nearly 3 a.m, sharing stories about growing up different, about parents who sacrificed everything for their children's education, about the weight of being the first in your family to enter worlds that weren't built for people like us. When she finally packed up her things to leave, Rachel paused at my office door. "Dr. Chen," she said, "thank you for showing us that it's possible. Not just the technology, but everything else. The whole path." After she left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see lights scattered across the valley below, houses where families were sleeping, where children were dreaming their own impossible dreams. I thought about the scholarship students I'd been mentoring, young people who were building satellites and writing code and discovering cures for diseases, all because someone had believed they deserved a chance. The irony wasn't lost on me. The boy who'd been told he didn't matter, whose dreams had been literally burned to ash, was now helping to launch the dreams of others. The communication systems we were designing would carry voices across impossible distances, connecting people who might otherwise never find each other. In a way, we were building bridges between worlds, exactly what I'd been trying to do with that high school satellite project all those years ago. A year into my tenure at the facility, something unexpected happened. I received a call from Lincoln High School's new principal, a young woman named Dr. Martinez. no relation to my old principal, who had retired years earlier. She was calling to invite me to speak at their graduation ceremony. "Dr. Chen," she said, "we'd be honored to have you address our graduating class. Many of these students know about the Chen Award, and they've heard your story. You represent something important to them, the idea that where you start doesn't determine where you finish." I accepted, though the thought of returning to that place filled me with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anxiety exactly, but a kind of temporal vertigo, as if I might step through those doors and find myself 17 again, small and scared and convinced that my life was already over. The graduation ceremony was held on the football field, where I'd never played, under lights that had illuminated games I'd never attended. The graduating class was more diverse than mine had been, faces that reflected the changing demographics of the community, young people whose parents had come from places I'd visited during my military service. As I looked out at them from the podium, I saw my own teenage hunger reflected back at me, that desperate hope that education would be their bridge to something better. 26 years ago, I began. I sat where you're sitting now, believing that my future had been decided by forces beyond my control. I thought that because I wasn't popular, because my family didn't have connections, because I'd suffered a devastating setback, my dreams were essentially over. I paused, looking out at the sea of young faces under the stadium lights. I want to tell you something that no one told me at your age. Your story is not written by other people. Not by bullies, not by circumstances, not by failures or setbacks or moments when everything seems hopeless. Your story is written by the choices you make when you think no one is watching, by the work you do when no one believes in you, by the dreams you refuse to let die even when they seem impossible. In the front row, I spotted Mrs. Patterson, now retired but still attending graduations. She gave me a small nod, and I thought about that burnt circuit board sitting on my new desk, a reminder that sometimes our greatest failures become the foundation for our most important work. Some of you will face obstacles that seem insurmountable, I continued. Some of you will have your first dreams shattered, your careful plans destroyed, your confidence shaken to its core. When that happens, and it will happen, remember that every ending is also a beginning. Every closed door teaches you something about finding windows. Every failure is data that makes your eventual success more meaningful. After the ceremony, families gathered on the field for photos and congratulations. I was packing up my notes when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "David?" I turned to find Marcus Webb, now in his 40s with graying hair and the slightly soft look of middle management prosperity. He was alone, wearing a simple suit that looked off the rack rather than tailored. "Marcus," I said, surprised. "I didn't know you still lived here." "I moved back 5 years ago," he said, his hands fidgeting with his car keys. "Divorce, job change, needed to start over somewhere familiar." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "I heard you were speaking tonight. I needed to see you." We stood there for a moment in the strange intimacy of shared history. Two middle-aged men carrying the weight of decisions made when they were boys. "I've been going to therapy," Marcus said suddenly, "working through a lot of things from when we were kids. The therapist says I need to make amends where I can, even if it's too late to really matter." "It's not too late," I said, surprising myself with the words. "Isn't it?" he asked. "I destroyed your future, David. We all did. And you still became this incredible person, but not because of us. Despite us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the confident bully from our teenage years, but a man who'd been carrying guilt like a stone in his chest for decades. "You want to know something?" I said. "I used to fantasize about this moment, about confronting you, making you understand what you'd taken from me. But standing here now, I realize you didn't take anything that mattered." His eyes filled with tears. "How can you say that? We destroyed your project, cost you your scholarships, changed the entire trajectory of your life." "You changed the path," I said, "but not the destination. The boy who built that satellite was always going to become someone who protected others, who solved impossible problems, who refused to give up when things got hard. You couldn't burn that out of me because it wasn't in the project, it was in me." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, A gesture so vulnerable it made him look 17 again. "I have a son," he said. "He's 15, and he's a lot like you were. Smart, quiet, different. And I see how some of the other kids treat him, and it makes me sick, because I know I was one of those kids once." He took a shaky breath. "I tell him your story sometimes. Not the part about what we did, but about what you became. I tell him that being different isn't a weakness. It's a superpower, if you're brave enough to use it." We talked for another hour as the stadium emptied around us, two men finally having the conversation they should have had as boys. When we parted ways, there was no dramatic reconciliation, no moment of perfect forgiveness, but there was something better. The quiet understanding that we'd both become different people than the children we'd been, and that sometimes the most important healing happens not through grand gestures but through simple acknowledgement of shared humanity. 6 months later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a teenage boy holding a trophy, his face bright with pride and accomplishment. On the back, someone had written, "Marcus Webb, Jr. First Place, State Science Fair, Advanced Communications Division. Thank you for showing him what's possible." I placed the photo on my desk next to the burnt circuit board, these bookends to a story that had taken decades to fully understand. The scared 17-year-old who'd watched his dreams burn had become the man who helped other young dreamers build their own futures. The project that had been destroyed had evolved into something far more important. Not just advanced technology, but advanced hope. That evening, I called my team together for our weekly progress meeting. We were on the verge of a breakthrough with our Mars communication array. Technology that would allow real-time conversations between Earth and the Red Planet for the first time in human history. As we worked through the final calculations, I watched these brilliant young minds building tomorrow with the same passion I'd felt in my parents' garage all those years ago. "Dr. Chen," Rachel asked as we were wrapping up, "what do you think the first message from Mars should be?" I thought about it for a moment, remembering the first signal I'd received from my homemade radio telescope, that faint whisper from Andromeda that had made me feel connected to something infinite. "Something simple," I said. "Something that reminds us that distance doesn't diminish connection, that being far from home doesn't mean being alone." As the team dispersed for the evening, I remained in the lab, surrounded by the quiet hum of equipment that would soon carry human voices across the solar system. Outside the windows, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars I'd looked up at as a child, wondering if anyone was looking back. The boy who'd built a satellite to talk to the universe had grown up to build systems that would let the universe talk back. It had taken 3 decades, a detour through military service, and the long journey from hurt to healing. But somehow I'd ended up exactly where I was always meant to be. The next morning brought news that would change everything once more. The president had signed legislation establishing a new space exploration initiative, with funding for permanent research stations on the Moon and Mars. They wanted me to head the communication division for the entire program. It was the opportunity of several lifetimes, the chance to quite literally reach for the stars. As I sat in my office, looking out at the mountains and thinking about the path that had brought me here, I realized that the story wasn't about the reunion, or the medal, or even the revelation of old betrayals. It was about the simple, revolutionary idea that we are not defined by what happens to us, but by what we choose to do next. The scared teenager from Lincoln High School had learned to transmit hope across impossible distances. And tomorrow, we would begin teaching the entire human race to do the same. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.